Hey there, thank you for tuning into Duck Bricks. Over the years, LEGO designers have produced countless ideas that never made it to market. Be it theme ideas, or sets, or even canceled parts, there is a treasure trove of canceled LEGO ideas that are sitting in the vaults at LEGO that we've never seen before until now. In this episode of Brick Breakdown, we will be taking a look at some of the most interesting canceled LEGO prototypes across the entire range of LEGO themes. Last time we talked about the vintage LEGO prototypes, stuff like Castle and Space and City, and be sure to check that out in the description if you haven't already. But this time we'll be taking a look at some of the more recent action themes, stuff like Vikings, fantasy era, kind of the action themes that came before Ninjago and even before Power Miners and Atlantis, but served as some original concepts that LEGO was trying out in the early years of development. So let's take a look at some of these original action-themed prototypes, starting off right now.
As per usual, we have our special guest, LEGO David, joining me all the way from Europe, so thank you so much, LEGO David, for being here. I think it's probably a good time to start things off with LEGO Vikings. Now, Vikings, of course, debuted in 2006, but it has a slew of fascinating prototypes because it seems the theme went through several different iterations before coming to shelves. They originally had the theme conceptualized as having a much larger focus on Norse mythology. It wasn't just Vikings versus dragons, but instead it was Vikings versus a different kind of Norse creature in every single set. So in certain sets you have a squid, you have the wolf, you have a dragon for sure, but then you also have a troll, and you even have the Midgard serpent. So some of these animals actually did make it in, but at some point in the theme's development, it appears that the focus shifted from the Norse mythology creatures to basically just dragons, plus one or two other models that had gone sufficiently far in development that they felt like they were fine with putting into sets. I think a good place to really illustrate this change is by starting off with the smaller set. Set number 7016 would later go on to become the Viking Boat versus Dragon set. It was a very small Viking boat versus a dragon, and you can see the original concept for what the set was supposed to be is radically different. I actually don't even think that this build ever appeared in any other Viking set, right?
I don't think they did. Like that little squid thing there, I don't think they ever used anything similar to that. And it looks surprisingly good for this scale.
Exactly. Honestly, this reminds me a lot of what would come in future LEGO lines, especially in the Aqua Raiders line. I think we got a squid relatively similar to this, or at least also using that Alpha Team cockpit piece. And then we also would get stuff like this for Atlantis, and I think even some of the creator sets used a squid like this. But kind of interesting how the Vikings line, which I often associate with the dragons, because of course that was the heavy focus of the theme, actually had a concept for something like this instead. I kind of wonder why they changed it all to pretty much just different sizes and colors of dragons besides one or two other random animals. But besides an abnormally large boat mold, which was a pretty rare mold around that time, only appeared in a few other sets, there's not too much to say about this. I will say the eventual set that we got was probably an improvement, at least in terms of the quantity of stuff that we got in the set, an entire boat with the sail and some ropes, as well as a little dragon with some fabric wings. So we definitely did get a lot of stuff in the set that this would become, but it's still interesting to see a completely different concept for a set. But then I guess we can move on to some of the more interesting Viking stuff. We have two different prototypes for set number 7018, which was the Viking Longboat challenges the Midgard Serpent. Really interesting one for the first one. It seems to be highly stylized. In fact, it looks almost Photoshop partway, like they took what was a very much work in progress prototype for a certain line of sets, and then they just heavily photoshopped it or kind of drew over it for the cover art of a magazine. Seems like this is one of the very early prototypes. And then we have something that's a lot closer to our actual set that actually uses real LEGO pieces, unlike some of the pieces here, which are very clearly just drawn on. But immediately my eyes are drawn to that serpent. What do you think about this?
Look at that, using dinosaur mesosaur bodies like to make the body of the snake is something really crazy and unique about this. That looks really cool.
Man, well, I am happy with what I got, and this would definitely not be practical as an actual LEGO set. I just can't help but wonder, what if LEGO actually released something as gargantuan as this? It just honestly is a really cool set concept. I understand why they didn't go with this, because that would have skyrocketed the set budget like crazy. but it's still really fun to look at, and honestly I kind of feel like this is more in place with, say, like a Lego movie type thing where you really don't have budgetary constraints of molds, or even maybe Machus could go for something like this if the Mosasaurus body wasn't so expensive. I almost want someone to try to recreate this using the shark head mold from the Ogle attack shark as well as the Mosasaurus body kind of chained together. Such an interesting design, and honestly, just a lot of really cool stuff about this Serpent, and as a first iteration, it looks really, really cool. But then there's another really major piece of interest here. What do you think of the minifigures?
Oh my gosh, that's insane. Also look at the beards they have. There's another one close to the front of the sheep. Look at that beard thing. Looks like it's like flapping in the wind or something.
How do you think this prototype as a whole stacks up against the actual set?
I think it's a lot more interesting than the actual set. Not to say the actual set isn't good, it's still great, but yeah, the Sea Serpent and the Vikings themselves are a lot more interesting. One thing that really bothers me about the Viking minifigures is that they didn't use the beard molds, because they removed the beard molds fearing that kids would be turned off by the main characters having beards and being older. So yeah, that's kind of a shame.
Yeah, it's really too bad. I don't really get that logic. It doesn't really make too much sense to me, because as a kid, at least, I always thought the beard pieces were kind of fun to play with. But maybe Lego didn't want every single character to have it, but at least I would say give it to like the main chief or something. But at least we did get some of the beards, at least beards that looked like this in the Fantasy Era line for the Dwarves in Castle, and then we would get many, many more beards with Lord of the Rings. So at least nowadays we have a pretty good variety, although back then it's too bad that some of these more fantastical ones didn't get made. The other thing that kind of interests me about the minifigures are the helmets too. The horns are kind of crazy looking. They're not just using the standard Baraki tooth piece there. They're actually having these wildly fantastical molds. I can't tell if that's dual molded or drawn on, or a completely new mold for a piece that they just never decided to create. Not really sure what's going on with those, but they certainly look very formidable. But I guess we can move on from this first version of the prototype. Any closing thoughts on this particular image?
Yeah, that original Serpent design looks amazing. It's really a shame we didn't get actually that one. Though I think they kind of went a little bit crazy with it, like having it be so big and use so many like early 2000 molds and such.
But then I guess we can move on to the second iteration of the prototype versions of this set. It looks like this was the very first iteration, and then they had the second model showing on screen right here. And it's actually very rare that we get multiple prototypes like this. Usually we're kind of getting lucky if we even see one, but two actually made their way to the internet. Now, what do you think of this second version of the model?
This looks pretty much the same as the set we actually got, except it's slightly different. One thing that's interesting is that the Midgard Serpent seems to have some sort of fangs there, not just the upper part of the head. So it's basically the same mold, except it has those fangs. So yeah, the rest of the snakes looks pretty much the same as the finalized one. As for the boat itself, I think they only include beard for like the leader, like the Viking King. The other ones don't seem to have beards. In the finalized set, none of the Vikings had any sort of beard.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You bring up some really great points. Honestly, my favorite thing about all of these is that we often, again, don't really get to see this kind of behind-the-scenes, in-production look of the different stages a certain model goes through, and much less getting leaked to the public. So it's quite fascinating to me to see how this set changed from what looked to be a conceptual design with a ship versus a serpent, and then a more down-to-earth design with a much more closer and realistic thing to what we got in the actual set, and then finally the set itself. I agree with your point about the beards. It's honestly a shame how in the first artwork, every single one had a new beard mold, had a very crazy looking one, and then for the second iteration, only the leader had a beard mold, and then for the final iteration that we actually got, none of them did. So really interesting how they kind of slowly phased them out there. What's also interesting is the development of the Serpent. While I do absolutely love the one from the conceptual art, definitely does not make sense as an actual set, I will say. It's kind of a little bit too crazy. The second one, again, as you said, basically what we got. I do actually like the use of the recolored dinosaur flipper pieces in the one that we got. I think using those makes a lot of sense to me, rather than the hose or tube tail pieces that seem a little bit cut off on this second preliminary model. That being said, though, I think the head on the second one is pretty interestingly shaped. I'm kind of curious. Again, you brought up the whole teeth aspect of it. Not really sure how that would have worked out as an actual part. It's a little bit too low res for us to really tell what's going on there, but I do actually like the part that we got because they actually molded it to fit within the style of the Bionicle Rakshi piece, which personally is just a really interesting thing to me, just enjoying the mold as an element from Lego. They actually put in some stylized details to make it meld and flesh together with the older piece. So kind of cool how they did that. But now I guess we can move on from this one set, which was a pretty fascinating journey of a Lego set, taking a look at all the prototypes here. And then we can move on to set number 7019, which was the larger set, the Viking Fortress. Now this one is pretty radically different from what we got. What are your initial thoughts on this model and how it stacks up to the actual set?
This one is really interesting because it uses a lot of Bionicle pieces, especially for that thing there, whatever it's supposed to be, that monster.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and again, this goes back to the whole concept of Vikings originally being about more just different aspects of Norse mythology other than just dragons. It's kind of interesting how this is a combination of Bionicle, of Knight's Kingdom, of all sorts of different building styles. You can even see some dinosaurs parts in there for the feet. While it isn't obviously the best build, I kinda wish we saw this as an actual set just because of how weird and wacky it is, and how kinda cool it is to see a brick build or construction figure in a regular Lego system set. In fact, I can't even think of the last time that we even got something like this where minifigures were coexisting with a large construction style figure. So honestly, I'm a pretty big fan. There are some things I do actually like about this. I can't quite tell what piece is being used for the jaw there. Looks like the underside of maybe a dragon mouth or something like that, but the Nuva shoulder armor as a face and eyes, I mean, obviously they use that in the hockey sets, but it really does work for this character in particular, and really you can actually see the face being pretty well defined, I will say. Add to that the legs are obviously just your standard Knight's Kingdom legs, but you actually do have some different colors of the Knight's Kingdom armor pieces and whatnot. It's a very interesting build that I wish was also still included in the set. But that being said, what do you think of the actual build in general? Because as you can see, this build is pretty radically different from what we actually got as well. Even ignoring the large orc monster or ogre or whatever that's supposed to be, the fortress itself is pretty different.
What I like about this one is how they use a lot of those like Borak shields to form like kind of like decorative shields. I think that looks really cool. And look at that sword mold. That looks like it's a combination between a Knight's Kingdom sword and like a Borak shield. Look at that.
Yeah, it's honestly kind of crazy how many different molds at least they were considering for doing for the Vikings line. Obviously, all the minifigures here, they've got the molded beards, which we've talked about at length earlier in the video, but even if you go on the close-up of the hammer the minifigure is holding, that looks to be a new molded hammer piece. It's honestly closest to one of the more modern Cole Ninjago hammers that they do today, where they slap on one of those fez pieces on the ends, or maybe some whited rounder pieces that are much more modern pieces today that you can kind of achieve that effect. But, I mean, obviously this is way back in 05, 06 when this was being conceptualized. They didn't have any of those pieces, so that looks like a brand new mold for the hammer, which again we never got in the Vikings line. So really, really interesting stuff here. Honestly, I like a lot of things about this, but I also do like the final design. I think the back gate is actually pretty cool. The way that it's structured is pretty interesting, having a soul tower in the back. But the actual set, I think the front gate is a lot more interesting. It has this whole black design that makes it stand apart from the just brown walls instead of just having it be a continuation of the walls. It really does feel like the gate is some special centerpiece that really calls the set apart. And then, of course, they changed up the shields, the printing on it, from these relatively simplistic colors to a much more detailed and kind of some shiny outlines on the shields. So I do actually really appreciate that upgrade as well. And if you look at the final set, they did still use some Borak shields, at least for the catapults there, where the minifigures are mounted. They have some of the Parak Kal shields right up the front there. So at least some of that design influence translated over. Kind of interesting to see that. But yeah, again, this is a pretty radical departure from one set to another, and I honestly can't help but wonder what it would be like if we actually got Vikings with these specialized creatures instead of just dragons, even though the green dragon in the set is pretty neat.
So in the finalized set, they just reused the same dragon design as the another set, just in a different color. So having this thing would have probably been more interesting, in my opinion. So I think I sort of prefer this one over the one we got, because look at the Vikings this time, they still have interesting beard molds, and the build itself looks a lot more interesting with those kind of Borak shields all over. I think that actually is a nice added detail, which looks good, and the monster itself is a lot more interesting than the dragon we actually got in the finalized, it was just a recolor of a different dragon. Like this really weird blend of system, Bionicle, and Knight's Kingdom here actually really works for me, surprisingly enough. It looks quite unique.
Honestly, yeah, I think they even pulled off the whole Bionicle and system integration better than the actual Bionicle playsets. Here, the integration of the Borak shields, especially on the front gate and the sides of the castle, actually do feel like it stands out, like it actually does work well with this thing. And of course, the character or creature that they've got over there, the large ogre, actually does appear that it would pose a significant threat to a fortress like this, and honestly provides a little bit more interesting conflict, especially for this kind of walled building over here. The dragon, well, the dragon can just fly over the walls, so the walls aren't really doing much against protecting from these invaders, but then when you got this ogre that's pretty tall, about as tall as the walls, but seems like he would still be an impediment to him actually getting inside. So definitely, I think probably the conflict could have been a little bit more fun having that ogre in the set, because again, you actually have to have him attacking the walls, trying to break the gate open and whatnot, rather than just having the dragon literally just fly over it. But then I think it's a good time to move on to the next prototype for Vikings. It's a pretty different design again from what we got. This time it's featuring a bull-like creature instead of a Fenrir wolf. Again, a very interesting bull for mostly being built out of Technic and Bionicle pieces. I actually really do like the shaping of this. I'm honestly really impressed for it coming from a set from 2006. I probably wouldn't have expected it to be looking this good, but honestly, I look at this and I immediately am thinking it is a bull, even right down to the whip tail, the horns on the front, the kind of aggressive front angled stance. Looking pretty good to me, but what do you think?
So I really like the use of the Borak shields for wheels. Actually, that really works for me. And the Fairies Wolf itself, I don't know, it looks more something like a different creature, not really a wolf. I think the finalized one was better. I mean, I can't really tell what it's supposed to be. Those horns make me think like a bull or something.
Yeah, to me it's very clearly not supposed to be a wolf. It very much looks like a bull to me, which is kind of interesting how they went in a different direction. I honestly kind of like the build for this bull, although the wolf wasn't too bad either. It was a pretty interesting design as an official LEGO set. And yeah, it's kind of interesting how they use some of those Borak shields as wheels. Honestly, I think that really works. The piece is pretty perfect for what they are, despite not rolling, of course, but it still actually works out pretty well.
They also used a Rockshi blade up there as well.
Oh yeah, they did. I didn't even catch that. Kind of a strange placement, but maybe it's supposed to be some sort of a banner, or I guess it's some sort of an ornamental design on the top. Still nice they included it though.
I really wish LEGO used more of those Bionicle pieces in more system sets, because honestly this is a really nice blend of the two systems and really proves the versatility of LEGO as a whole. And Bionicle, a lot of AFOLs tend to think like Bionicle it's its own thing, you can't really mix it with LEGO, but here it is, LEGO themselves did it, so what else can you say?
Honestly, yeah, I'm actually pretty impressed with the use of the Bionicle pieces here, and again, it kind of makes me wish that the Bionicle system sets were like this, because they certainly did not use pieces to this extent. If I recall correctly, a lot of the Bionicle system sets really just felt like they had the Bionicle parts slapped on, really didn't feel like cohesive builds, but here they actually looks like they put some thought into it. The use of the Nuva shoulder armor as the front kind of curved back of the bull actually looks really good, and I also again really like that wheel piece used. Obviously it doesn't roll, but it actually does look like some metal or rock wheels that fits perfectly on a fantasy like vehicle like this one. So yeah, kind of some really nice piece usages here. But I guess with that is the final Vikings prototype that we have to look at. There were quite a few different minifigure designs that they were seemingly considering over this lineup, as well as a bunch of different creatures as well before deciding on dragons. All in all, a very interesting depiction at what Vikings could have been. But then I guess the next step is to take a look at some of the other prototypes from some of the other themes of this era. I guess now we can move on to LEGO Knights Kingdom. Now, previously we dedicated an entire Construction Conversations episode to discussing Knights Kingdom. We talked a lot about the story and the lore behind it, as well as its origins in story fashion, so probably don't need to go too much into that. For people interested, I have linked in the description below. But today I guess it's a good time to take a look at some of these set prototypes. Now I will say these are a little less interesting than the Vikings ones. They're honestly a lot closer to what we actually got, although there are a few interesting things to take a look at, so I figured why not just group it together in this video.
Vladek's Fortress, I think, is the most interesting one. Look at that. They seem to have like a red Vladek mask recolor there. And those swords kind of like form like an archway to the fortress. That's cool.
Yeah, those mask and sword recolors are pretty neat. I don't know if those are just preliminary stuff, because I know that LEGO sometimes tends to just not color masks or color them a solid color when they're preliminary, stuff like that, but it would have been really cool to get just a plain solid color for that. Shame that we never actually got it in the set, but otherwise, I mean, this looks pretty much almost exactly what we got, other than those two changes, so honestly nothing too crazy going on here, but I agree, it would have been really nice to get those recolors, especially because we would actually see some of those other colors in silver for the swords at the front and the mask color in other future sets, so nothing was really too special about these, but having them recolored would have been. And then we have this set number 8875 here. Kind of interesting to see the major difference here being using the molded large action figure construction shield as the part of the siege tower there instead of just using a printed element. Kind of interesting how they seem to have gone back and forth on that at the point in production of this set. I don't even know if they even had that mold created yet, or maybe they weren't sure if they were going to have a new mold for it, which is why they printed it. But I mean, otherwise it's pretty much exactly the same exact build other than the use of that one piece, so kind of interesting to see there. The more radical change, though, is for 8874, which the build generally stayed the same, but there's some color differences. What do you think of this?
This one is a little bit different than the final one. This one seems to be using more like bright red instead of dark red from what I can see.
Yeah, I honestly can't even tell if that's just the color grading or that was actually the original color for the villain faction before changing to dark red. Because honestly, it really looks to me like not even were the colors just different, but even the minifigure torsos and the arms are completely different as well, featuring the regular standard bright red instead of dark red. But honestly, at this point, I can't really tell if that's just the lighting. But then, that is about it for the Knights Kingdoms prototypes. We do have just one more set that's basically unchanged. The only thing that's really different about this is the way the catapult is constructed, and the fact that we would have actually gotten black one-length Technic bushings in a cheap set, which honestly would have been really nice. Probably would have decreased that brickling price a bit, but nothing really too crazy going on with these prototypes, unlike the Vikings ones.
So yeah, the Knights Kingdom sets are easily the least changed ones.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We can probably wrap up this section right now. Since we're on the topic of Vikings and Knights Kingdom, why don't we just jump ahead a few years and take a look at some of the fantasy era castle prototypes from 2008 and 2009. These were primarily released via the Brick Journal magazine feature. There was an entire spread on the development of the Dwarves Mine, as well as the main castle for the heroes, plus the Trolls Mountain Fortress as well. So some pretty interesting stuff to see here. Despite it only being 3 sets, they actually walk people through the entire development process, which is really nice, and I think it'd be pretty interesting to cover. Let's start off with the first prototype here of the Dwarves Mine. What do you think of this?
That looks more like a mock than an actual set, to be honest. Like an amateur mock, to be honest. I mean, it's a good kids mock, but still kids mock.
Yeah, I can kind of see what you're getting at. The one technique that I do actually really like about this first one was that they actually used some suspended rail system, so it looks like they actually took the flex hoses and put some sort of a hanging bucket with suspended rails. I think that's pretty neat. Everything else, though, yeah, it's pretty basic, and it's just using these standard big ugly rock pieces on the sides, so honestly, that's the only interesting thing about it, and really the only thing I wish was still retained for the actual set, although a semblance of the mechanism was retained throughout the curved flex tube instead. So honestly, I think that what we got was a lot better, probably the best iteration, and obviously the second iteration here is basically the same as what we got. There are some sort of decal changes, maybe some minor color changes, But otherwise, I think the version that we got is probably the best out of the three here. Moving on to the King's Castle, though, it's a lot more interesting because they originally had a pretty radically different design for it. What do you think of this?
It looks quite unique. It's a really unique castle design that we haven't really seen that much. Though it still kind of uses a lot of those kind of like big castle wall pieces, which are going to severely reduce the actual building process.
This first prototype is definitely better than the previous first prototype, but yeah, I see what you mean. Again, it is using those larger pieces. The one thing I do actually like, though, is the shaping of the walls. They actually have these kind of cylindrical pieces acting as windows that form a unique shape that we haven't really seen in any other LEGO castle. And the kind of emblem or shield at the front is also pretty unique, kind of an interesting detail there. What I do find interesting is that all of the versions retain this asymmetrical look and feel with a side bridge going on to the top there, which is pretty interesting. Not very many LEGO castles are asymmetrical like this, and for the ones that are, they don't really have these sort of bridges suspended in midair, so that is a cool detail. Otherwise, though, moving on to the second iteration, it's, again, basically the same as the final set. Looks like they were just refining things here and there, although I kind of do wish that they kept the angled style of the walls being brick built, rather than just using the angled castle wall piece all the way on the bottom there. But now I think we can move on to the most interesting prototype, in my opinion. Here it is. What do you think?
Ooh. I think I kind of prefer this one over... I really like those kind of tattered tents or whatever they're supposed to be. Like those kind of coverings. Those look really cool.
Oh, same. I really love those tattered cloth elements. Really wish we actually got that in a set. Kind of a shame that we never did. That being said, though, the original set is actually one of my favorite Castle Fantasy era sets. I'm actually a huge fan of the way it's designed. You can see in the second prototype here, it looks a lot closer to what we actually got. And I am a really big fan of it also because of the really interesting tower and spire that they have in the back there, which I do feel is kind of missing on this one. Again, the King's area kind of feels a little bit sparse, at least compared to the official set. And while I do like the archways on the front, having the trolls be tucked under the arches in the final set, I think was a great decision, as well as the unique kind of formation of the angled pieces used for the windows there, these diamond-shaped windows on the front, I think worked out really well for it, so definitely pros and cons of both. I honestly just wish that they took the final set and then placed even just one of those tattered awnings above the taller spire tower on the top. I feel like that would have been the best of both worlds here. But what do you think of both of these prototypes and how they stack up against the final set?
So yeah, it's a lot more similar to the second one. You can still enclose it kind of like that. But yeah, I think I kind of prefer the general shaping of the first one, though it still kind of needs more refinement, especially like in the King's throne section there. It looks a little bit basic.
Oh yeah, for sure. And again, would have been really nice to get kind of a best of both worlds scenario, though I am pretty happy with what we got. But with those three sets, that about wraps up the Fantasy Era section of this video. Those are the only three prototypes that we have available to see, as far as I know. Now it's probably a good time to move on to the final theme around this era to be discussed, which actually came out before Fantasy Era, but of course that will be Aqua Raiders. Now we have just 3 Aqua Raiders prototypes. We have the main base, we have 2 smaller sets as well, and they're also pretty interesting to look at and actually differ from the final sets quite a lot. So I guess we can just get into these if you haven't seen these before.
I've not seen the Aquaraiders prototype, so I'm curious what we have.
Alright, so the first one here is the Angler Attack. This one is at least kind of similar in build to what we actually got, but the, of course, colors, minifigure, decals, everything else is pretty different. So what do you think of this?
Honestly, this looks like something straight out of the late 90s, to be honest. Like the way it's built and the pieces used. This looks like something that I could have seen coming out like in 1999 or 2000, somewhere around that time.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because, I mean, in the background you have one of the minifigures with the standard, or I guess newer for the time, diver's mask, but then the one driving the vehicle has that standard Aqua Zone mask, which was all the way back from the 90s, and that's a really interesting piece usage there. I kind of wish that they brought that back for this theme, but I do understand wanting to go in a different direction. The other thing that kind of interests me is that they completely changed the color of the anglerfish from dark green and lime to this dark blue color. Not really sure why they made that change, but kind of cool to see a prototype completely change like that over the course of development. It also looks like, unfortunately, the Sea Speeder, or whatever this little diver vehicle is called, was changed from something much larger with 2 arms sticking out. Instead, it was just changed to this much smaller vehicle. Although I do appreciate how streamlined and aerodynamic, or I guess underwater dynamic, this vehicle is for the final set, so I can't complain too much. Obviously, I think this is probably the least interesting out of all of them. Seems like some of the parts budget went to creating some rocks on the seafloor instead. So kind of a neat detail how they seem to have completely changed at least the front of the vehicle in that regard, as well as of course the color of the creature. But moving on from this one, the next prototype we have up, honestly, the official set is a bit of a downgrade, I'm going to be honest. It's set number 7770, instead of a just singular water vehicle, which is a little bit larger, plus a treasure chest and some foliage and rock pieces on the bottom of the ocean floor, we were supposed to get a full-on crab as well as a much smaller diving vehicle. Honestly, would have much preferred the crab, but what do you think about this?
I like the color scheme. The gray and orange surprisingly quite works.
How do you think this compares against the actual crab set that we got in the end?
The final one is better, but I still think it's quite an interesting design.
Definitely agreed, and I definitely do wish that we got this as a small set instead of what we actually got, which was just a standalone sub. Always good to have some built-in conflict in a box, especially in sets this small. But then we can move on to the arguably most interesting prototype for Aqua Raiders. This is the largest set, number 7775, the Aqua Base Invasion.
Wait, they actually used that piece from Star Wars for the cockpit from the droid Tri-Fighter. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's probably just a placeholder. I was guessing they'd be printing it in a different print or even just not printing it at all like they did in the final set. But yeah, kind of nice how they actually used one of those licensed pieces at least to conceptualize the model. What's also really interesting is that sub is completely different as well. Although I do kind of like the more traditional small sub that we got in the set.
Honestly, this looks a lot more interesting than the final set because look at that kind of underwater tunnel thing. That looks really cool with a transparent blue. Why they remove that is kind of beyond me, to be honest. Why? Why would you do that?
Yeah, it's a really big shame because that honestly adds a lot to the design. I guess the final set had to allocate the budget towards a larger landing platform for the submarine, but honestly, it looks like this even has a docking platform for this submarine as well, with those Technic axles sticking out of the side. Probably would have much preferred having those glass pieces there instead of just a larger platform, especially because it seems like the prototype could actually have the sub be docked anyway. The other thing is we actually would have gotten 2 lengths of that transparent blue launching tube in the center rather than just 1 length, so definitely seems like potentially some budget cuts were made here. I'm guessing that this initial prototype was probably a little over the set's budget and they had to cut it down a little bit, but it still is a huge shame because this looks really fantastic. And even if you look at the height comparison, that turret is mounted a lot taller than it was in the final set, so definitely a lot of really interesting modifications going on here that seem to not have actually occurred in the final set, apparently due to budget, I guess, so that's kind of a shame.
Yeah, the actual squid looks very similar except it's a different color.
Yeah, honestly though, I do really like what we got in the final set, down to the eye detail and the dark blue color. Pretty much everything seems to be an improvement, at least for the squid.
Yeah, the squid we got in the final set is better.
100%. But I guess with that, we've kind of wrapped up all the themes we're going to be discussing today, and now I know people in the comments may be asking where Exoforce is. I will also say that it's because we actually are making a separate Exoforce video focusing on the origins and history of the theme because there's just so much stuff to cover, so I decided to exclude the prototypes talk about Exoforce from this video and instead put it into that video. So if anyone's wondering, yes, it is coming. It's going to take a little bit of time because I'm trying to actually purchase a few more of the models to showcase some of the combo models as well. So once I get a ton of those ready, I'll be able to put out that video and we'll be discussing the prototypes as well. But I guess we can probably head into these summary thoughts now. I'm kind of curious, out of all the things we looked at today, what was most interesting to you and what stood out the most as stuff that you wished we would have gotten?
Definitely the Viking stuff was the most interesting. The other teams barely had any concept art or prototypes. They had only 1 or 2 or just a few. Easily Vikings is the most interesting there.
I gotta agree with you. The Viking stuff was so cool to look at, even if some of them really didn't make too much sense as sets, especially if you kind of consider the amount of different molds that would have been required to pull off the Mosasaurus-esque sea serpent. Still super cool stuff to see. Kind of wish we got an official Lego build like it. So I really definitely would have wanted to see that. Although the Viking sets that we did get were pretty good as well. But with that, we've about wrapped up this video talking about 3 of the major original LEGO action-adventure themes from early on in its run, from the kind of 05 to 07 era here. Let me know down in the comments below, what did you guys think of these prototypes? Are there any that you wanted to see, or are you happy with what we got? And obviously stay tuned to Duck Bricks for even more talk like this. We're definitely going to be discussing more and more prototypes. I think next up is stuff like Space Police and Atlantis. And stay tuned to Duck Bricks for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Once again, special thanks to LEGO David for calling in all the way from Romania. So thank you, David, for being here. And thank you all for listening. Bye-bye for now.